Hey everyone, thanks for joining the show. This is the Christian and Tim show, and we're talking to you about the housing market in Canada and British Columbia and here in the Vancouver area. Tim's a mortgage broker, one of the finest in the city, and I work as a realtor in the Vancouver Burnaby area. If you've got questions on mortgages, on real estate, feel free to reach out to us. And of course, you're watching this on video. We're also on Spotify and Apple. You can find us there, the Tim and Christian show. Christian and Tim show. Okay, now let's jump into the first one. Just a lighthearted warm up here. Tim, one of Canada's great iconic franchises, Tim Hortons, has announced they are adding pizzas to the menu. Are you lining up for one?
No, no chance. Um, I I mean, I used to be a big Tim Hortons fan. Back when Roll Up the Rim, you actually still had to roll up the rim, and it was fun. And but I don't know. I feel like their food's gone quite a bit downhill over the last few years, maybe 10 or so. And yeah, I'll pop in there once in a while for a coffee or an ice cap in the summer. That's probably like the main thing I'll stop there for is an ice cap. But yeah, no, I'm not going there for pizza. But also, to be fair, I'm not really a pizza guy, so Tim Hortons and pizza doesn't really do it for me. But are you going there? Are you getting a Tim's pepperoni, or what do you think?
God, no, no, I wouldn't touch that stuff.
Yeah, it's like one step above like a 7-Eleven corner store pizza almost.
Yeah, I know. That's
Yeah,
not my, it's no, yeah, I'm not touching it.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And by the way, the reviews have not been so good so far. People are
Really,
saying it's basically bread with some cheese on it and there's no tomato sauce. So
I'm shocked. I'm never would have guessed.
I asked an employee once at Tim
Yeah,
Hortons, I said, where do you guys make these donuts? Where are they prepared?
yeah,
And apparently they are all baked at a central
yeah,
facility and they're flown in from Ontario, frozen,
yeah,
and then they just reheat them on site.
yeah. It's probably why they're not that good. Um,
That's why they're not that good. Yes. Let's jump into it. We're going to talk
cool.
about foreclosures to start off with. And the reason why we're talking about foreclosures is, I go through hundreds of listings on a weekly basis, literally one by one. And I have noticed a few more foreclosures. And I came across one on Homer Street earlier this week. And it just got me to think. I started asking myself, are there more foreclosures going on in the market right now? And I've done a little bit of digging on this. And I guess maybe I'll just throw it to you, Tim, there to begin with. If someone has a case of the shorts and they're really having trouble paying their mortgage, what do you like? What's the conversation like? Do they come to you? And how does that even work?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, well, hopefully they would come to somebody before it gets in dire straits and they start missing payments. Um, and hopefully they also have some equity in their home, so they have some sort of escape strategy. But I do get calls from people from time to time, and it depends why they're having a hard time. If they've racked up other debt that's say high interest debt, and they have some equity in their house, we can look at doing a refinance and kind of roll some of that other equity, and we'll actually make them a bigger mortgage. But then it kind of rolls everything into one and consolidates it, so it can lower the monthly cash flow burden. But realistically, if someone's having a hard time making their mortgage payments, sometimes the conversation is, look, like you can't afford this house anymore. And you have to get out. And it's a hard conversation to have, and people don't like hearing it, but we can try and exhaust all the options. But at the end of the day, that's usually that, or that can be, not usually, but that can be what it comes down to. And hopefully, you get there before, you start missing payments and have calls from the bank and stuff like that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I often associate foreclosures with private loans because the rates are much higher than a loan you'd get from one of the five big banks in Canada. Do you see more people struggling with foreclosures who have conventional mortgages with the big banks?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe just to take a step back from that for people who aren't aware, we kind of have three tiers of lending here in Canada. We have the prime or A level lenders, which are the big banks, and then there's also some credit unions in that space, and some what we call monolines, which are mortgage only banks. They all play on the A side, and they have the strictest terms for getting a mortgage. They're the most difficult to get there, so it's theoretically the least risky for the banks. Then there's the alternative or the B lenders, who are slightly more risky. It's slightly more risky for the banks, but still pretty strict. And then there's the private lenders who have much higher rates, and they don't look at as many documents, and they'll just lend a lot more people a lot more money. So by Nate, it's kind of the risk curve, if you will. And so yeah, farther down the risk curve on private loans, you are going to see more defaults and foreclosures. And it's actually interesting you asked. I had a conversation with a foreclosure lawyer, a couple weeks ago, and was asking him, how's business? And so actually, business is really busy. I said, oh, that's it's great for you, but maybe not great for the general public if that's the case. And so we were just chatting about it a little bit, and and this is totally anecdotal, and so this is not a trend or data or anything, just an anecdotal story. He was saying last year he was seeing a lot more privates, and that's kind of typical, but this year he's starting to see more kind of prime loans going into foreclosure. So anecdotally, maybe, but I think on the whole, the data kind of shows that and all the lenders put out their data on their foreclosures, and it's very, very low. I don't know the number, so I don't want to say a number, but it's fractions of a percent, like 0.15% or something like that. So it's extremely low, and yeah, not that concerning.
Absolutely. And I was looking into the numbers actually on the number of foreclosures, both for attached properties and detached properties. And what our realtor system here called Paragon, where we can log in and you see all the listings and sometimes the realtor remarks and so on. Out of 4,260 homes, detached homes, there are 34 foreclosures right now in the Lower Mainland. So it's a very, very low number.
Yeah.
And out of condos and townhomes, out of over almost 7,000, there are currently 39 foreclosures.
Yeah.
And I think it's a tick or two higher than we normally have,
Yeah.
from what I've noticed. But again, it's just so minuscule. It barely registers. I think the numbers here are something like the default rates are at 0.15%.
Okay.
Which is
Yeah.
like saying
Yeah.
less. What is that? That's 1 out of 1,000.
Yeah.
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 So it's pretty low. And
Yeah.
and I think sometimes when you see this covered in the news media, it seems like, the earth is shaking, something's about to happen, and it doesn't look like that based on the numbers.
Yeah. But I also think, it's worth keeping an eye on, because it does kind of give an interesting indication of where things are at. And it's not like we need to get to 5% for there to be an issue. 1% would be a pretty significant thing. But from everything that I've heard, nobody's that, like, I think everyone thinks they're going to go up. But we're at very, very low levels. So even going up a bit is still not that concerning. But one thing I did want to ask you about is something I've been curious about is, what is the process for buying a foreclosure look like? How does one do that? And is it do you get a good discount on it? Do the banks sell it for less money because it's a foreclosure? How does that work?
Well, I would say first put on your seatbelt, because it's a bumpy ride. I've been through the process. I've been through to the courthouse with a client making an offer on a foreclosure, and it is not a smooth process. I think people have this image that we get from American TV shows about this home in Topeka, Kansas that's gone through foreclosure, and now a couple comes and buys it for $178,000, renovates it, and sells it for $420,000.
Right.
And it's not that simple. The process here in BC is, in a nutshell, what happens is the home gets listed on the MLS, And the very first person that makes an offer, that's the trigger bid. So if the home's listed for
Mm,
750, in theory, you could have the first accepted offer be 690, which would be a great savings, a great discount if you could get it at that. But almost all the time, what happens is you go to the court and three or four other buyers show up, and they will know what that first bid is. They will
right.
know that it is 690, and they then have a sealed bid. Everybody gets one shot with the judge. Sealed envelope, your bank draft is attached. There are no conditions. There's no financing, no inspection, none of
Cash.
that. What's that?
It's cash.
Cash. Cash. And I've had people say, well, what about this? The judge is not going to warrant anything. If the sellers or the tenants pull out the appliances and sell those on Craigslist, too bad. So it's a very uncomfortable experience. My client was had an engineering background, very solid kind of guy, and he was a nervous wreck after this process. So I generally don't recommend it, and they generally need a lot of repairs too.
So, yeah, and I mean, having the cash to do it right then and there is, also going to limit the pool. But I just want to make sure I understand the process because it is kind of interesting. So let's say, someone, so who lists it on the MLS? First of all, is there a listing realtor or is it listed by, how does it get listed?
Yep, there's a listing realtor.
Okay.
And so the bank, I guess through the bank's lawyer, will contact a realtor,
Right.
and then they will list it on the
and
MLS.
and they list it on the MLS, and let's say they list it for 750, and you come across it and you have a client, or I say, hey, I want to buy this for 690, and I submit an offer for 690. Then boom, that's what you call the trigger bid. So then I suppose that starts the process, and then they have a court hearing to kind of finalize it, and then other people find out about it and they can show up to the court hearing to try and win it, so to speak. Now, as the person who submitted the trigger bid, do I get an opportunity to submit a second bid at the courthouse, or is my first bid the only bid that I can make?
No, you get an opportunity to re-up.
And is there? I think we talked about it last week, or I don't know if we. I think we talked about it on the show before. I know we've talked about it before, but in a typical real estate transaction, there's other conditions, that could sweeten the offer for the seller, closing, stuff like that. Um, in this sense, is the only thing that the judge considering the dollar value of the offer, or are there other considerations that the judge will take in when they're looking at these bids?
Great questions, Tim. No, they're really looking at the number for the most part, right? Because they have a responsibility to
That's
get the
what
highest price for the owner, because he's got to
that's
get whatever's left out has to go back to the owner.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought. Their sole duty is to get to squeeze the most out of it. So that's really interesting. Yeah, I can imagine it's the amount of people who would have the cash to go and do that, to have a bank draft ready for call it $690,000. There's that's a small group, but how much do they typically go for under, let's say, market value, whatever the a fair market value would be? Do they go significantly under that?
I don't think so. I think you're
No.
getting a maybe 3 to 5% under market. If
Huh.
it's anything more than that, you're going to have a circus at the courthouse, because everybody loves a good deal.
Yeah.
And so if you took a condo that was all things being all things being equal, it was worth about 800,000. And the trigger bid was like 705.
Right.
You would have people showing up.
Right. And so at the end of the day, yeah, I see what you mean about buckle up. It's not for the faint of heart, because is it really, you got to ask the question, is it really even worth it to, okay, there's cash, there's no conditions, you can't do an inspection, you don't know what's going to be there, and you're not, I mean, that could be worth it if you're getting a smoking deal, but if you're not even getting really that good of a deal, just go find a good realtor who can negotiate you a good deal on a resale property, and find you a good one there, and you can probably make it up anyway. So um
Exactly. I
and
don't recommend foreclosures. There's that time that's involved. I mean, now I think they can do some of these uh, court foreclosures online, so you
right.
don't have to go in person. But it's it's just it's not a fun process. You're not getting a deal.
No.
And it's if you're not gonna get a deal in Vancouver or Burnaby. Maybe if you go
Right.
out, east of Chilliwack, where there's
Hmm.
less buyers, you're going out in Merritt and there's a foreclosure there with a
Maybe.
small
Yeah.
town, small population.
That's probably the move if you wanted to get into this sort of thing, or it'd be something to consider. Now, another question, sorry. Who pays the buyer's realtor's commission on a transaction like that? Because typical
Ju-
can yeah,
Just like it would be with any other seller, really, most
comes
of the
from
time.
comes
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
listing.
Yeah. It comes from the listing side.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was the note on foreclosures.
Yeah.
Um, that's about it. Now
Yeah.
we were going to transition to another topic here, and this one is from a. Maybe I'll let you run with it, Tim.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. I'll tee it up here. So, um, this next topic is about pre-sales. Specifically, we read a story about well, I don't know if I shouldn't say investor, but a fellow who put a deposit down to buy a pre-sale, and for whatever reason, personal reasons, they were unable to close on the project when it closed. And I believe their deposit was around $80,000, and they were unable to close, and so they forfeited their deposit, and they weren't happy about this. They thought um, that they should have been able to sell their assignment, and for whatever reason they weren't able to sell their assignment. So um, they're suing the developer, saying that they should have been able to get they lost their deposit unfairly, basically, my understanding of it. And then an interesting development, the developer is countersuing the original, maybe plaintiff, I suppose is the correct legal term. The developers countersuing for defamation, saying that this person, went around to all these news media outlets to kind of try and drum up a story and make them look bad. And reading through it, there's arguments on both sides. So I'm going to refrain from taking a side, and until we kind of see it more play out. But I do think it sparks kind of an interesting conversation about pre-sales, and I wanted to ask you some questions about pre-sales, because it kind of highlights some of the risks of you put down your deposit, and if you can't close, that's obviously a big risk. But I wanted to start with a question. So in real estate transactions, failed transactions where they don't close, whether it's pre-sale or kind of more conventional transactions, these can end up leading to lawsuits. And in your experience, or from what how does the percentage of lawsuits for real estate transactions on pre-sales compare to kind of more traditional ones? Would you say there's more lawsuits or less lawsuits for pre-sales, or do you have any kind of gauge on that?
That's a great question. I wouldn't have specific
No.
numbers.
Just yeah, anecdotally, I'd kind of thought it was higher, but I was curious if because there seems to be kind of more, because it's always so far down the road, people don't think about it as much. Anyway.
I think the big issue with pre-sales that people get, like I was going to ask you, when we read through this
Mm-hmm.
article on this guy who lost his deposit,
Mm-hmm.
80K, and I guess he went pretty hard after the developer, and he was reaching out to the media. He was talking to a bunch of different associations and bodies and so on, and I guess just trying to kick up a storm, presumably because he's really pissed off that he lost his money. Now, a few other details in the story are like the developer did try reaching out to him, and I
Mm-hmm.
think they offered him an extension as well. And he went silent and just didn't respond at all, or didn't respond through his agent.
Mm-hmm.
And so a little bit of negligence maybe on his part. I guess just I guess my question would be is what kind of I don't know if you'd have an answer for this, but what kind of advice would you have for a guy like this who's maybe buying a pre-sale on the financing side of things? I can tell you about the real estate side of things,
Sure.
but maybe on the financing side of things, and this thing closes in 3 years from now.
So, if something's closing in 3 years from now, so I'm an independent mortgage broker. So, the longest rate holds I have are typically 4 months. So I can, approve someone for a mortgage closes within 4 months. I do have a couple that are about a year, but not as good. So what I try and advise people is, hey, go talk to. There's probably a bank that's connected to this project, and they will probably give you an approval, and go get an approval with them. And when 3 years comes, or 2 years and 8 months comes around, then come back and talk to me, and I can kind of get involved at that point, and shop around, and see what your best options are. But I always think if this is something someone's going to do, they need to make sure that they have kind of their bases covered in a worst case sort of scenario, and just making sure you're planning ahead, that making sure that they're aware of, yeah, this isn't really optional to close in 3 years. If you're doing this, you are going to buy this place, and you have to make sure. And so here's the things to think about, and not taking on other debts, making sure your income stays the same, making sure you can save up more for a down payment, and things like, what's your plan B if you lose your job or your situation does change? What's your plan B? Do you have an exit strategy if this doesn't work out? And what would that look like? Like for this gentleman, I actually, no, I won't even say for this gentleman, because I don't know the situation at all. I don't want to comment on it. But in a hypothetical situation where someone had a hard time closing on something, the alternative to not to forfeiting your deposit or getting sued is, you go the private route, like we talked about earlier, and maybe you go get a private mortgage at a crazy interest rate, and then you have to sell the place, and take a small loss, or kind of break even, and just get out of it. But yeah, just I try and make sure people, and this was one of my questions I had for you. I have a couple risks that I like to try and talk to people about, and make sure that they're aware of. I think the upside is, or the reward is, more self-evident in pre-sales than the risks. The reward is you're going to get this brand new place. It's, the market's going up. It's going to be worth way more than you pay for it now, kind of thing. And but what do you see as the risks? Because that's a conversation I try and have is, what are the risks in doing this, and what are the risks that you see in buying pre-sales?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And I think let's go through several. The first risk would be that the mortgage rates are a lot higher in the future than they are today. And this is anybody who was buying pre-sales in 2020 and was closing on them now is,
Mhm.
instead of paying a 2% rate, is paying a 5 or a 5.5 rate. So, can you qualify for that loan? Like you said, most of the time they have, because presumably they've done something with the bank that's connected with the project. Now that's one. The other thing here is job status. Like if you're changing your job or you lose your job,
Mhm.
well then you just may not qualify. So you have to be careful
Mhm.
and make sure you're not changing your job 3 months before the closing of
Yeah.
the project. So that's another one. I think a big one here is don't speculate on these things. So I I haven't had clients myself do this, but I've heard stories about people who are buying these things expecting the price to go up and then just thinking they can assign it. And it doesn't work that way. One is we can't always be sure the price is going to go up, of course. But the second thing here is the assignment. Since about 2019, the government has been really hard on assignments. And you got to read the disclosure
Yeah.
statement. The disclosure statement is the developer saying, here are the facts to this project, the timeline, the outside date by which we have to have this complete, or you get your money back, dear buyer. And you have to know these things. And the assignment now is often a 3% flat fee. So if you're assigning this thing for $800,000, the developer's asking for $24,000 from you. That's a lot of money. Now, these things can be negotiated, but they usually have a sentence in their disclosure statement that says that the developer has the arbitrary, keyword there, to arbitrary right to withhold the assignment option. And they
Yeah.
normally do. They do because they're not going to let 50 buyers assign and compete with the remaining units that they
Yeah.
still have to sell.
Absolutely.
They're not going to do that. And so there's a little bit of just, having to have some background in real estate, some background in
Yeah.
business, and having to read that disclosure statement, Tim.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to that with the selling the assignment not just being as, oh, buy it and low and it goes up and you just sell it and make money, because the way that and maybe this ties into something else we might chat about later, but the way that the profit is taxed on those, you also have to account for that, right? So but a couple other risks that I had noted down here, and I would like to get your feedback on them as well. As so I kind of qualify the risks in a couple different buckets. And the first one is kind of a qualification risk, like you talked about, whether it's from interest rates or your situation changing. The next one is a value risk or a market risk. And that's, if the market turns and you agree to buy something for 500,000, and then, when you go to close on it, it now appraises at 450. Well, you're still paying 500,000. So I call that the value risk or the market risk. And then the third risk is that I like to highlight is the developer risk. And in an article we were chatting about earlier with the foreclosures, there was a rumor mill in some circles that some condo projects may be in trouble. And if and I had a question for you is, what happens if I buy a pre-sale in a condo project that looks great, and then all of a sudden the developer, they made some errors or whatever, the economy goes bad and they go out of business. What happens to my deposit? What happens to the home I was buying? How does that work? Um,
Yeah. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is you're going to get your deposit back. The bad news is you may have been tied up with that pre-sale for 3 years, and you're
yeah,
now buying in at a much higher market. And there's been a number of news cases about this. There was a project over in Coquitlam, close to the IKEA, where you've Low Heat Highway and I think Blue Mountain. I don't want to mention the developer's name
no,
on air, but they look like just a Mickey Mouse job, and they never put shovels in the ground.
yeah,
And the pre-sale buyers would just get their deposits back. And instead of now having bought their one bedroom for 520, now they can go back in to the same market now and try and buy that one bedroom for probably about 700. And
yeah. And I mean, and there's another one in Coquitlam, and I don't even know who the developer is. I just saw it on the news, but there was a project, and the whole site collapsed when they were digging the underground parking. And I'm sure you saw it. It was a couple months ago now, and the video of the wall caving in was quite a stunning visual. And I was like, oh man, I hope I don't know anyone who bought a pre-sale in that, because that's a nightmare. But I think, like you said earlier about knowing a little bit about real estate and business, I think one thing you want to do if you're looking to get into a pre-sale is make sure that the developer is reputable. And that's where having a good realtor with good contacts who's been through the process before and can steer you in a good direction can be important. Because yeah, you want to make sure, because you mentioned earlier that don't speculate, but I would almost argue that any pre-sale purchase is a form of speculation, even if you're buying it to live in it. Because you're kind of speculating that it's actually going to get done on time for the value that you're paying for it, right? Because you're agreeing to pay a value for something. We're agreeing today to buy something in 3 years from now at a given value. So it's kind of speculation that even if it doesn't go up, that it's going to be worth at least that, right? So I would argue now I'm not speculating like you were kind of saying to flip it, but there's an element of speculation in it. So I really think, buying a pre-sale, you really have to do some serious due diligence into, all the different kind of factors we chatted about. Do you have any good pre-sale stories that you can share?
I just think that people have to find out as much as they can about the developer.
Okay.
If you're dealing with a big brand builder like a Bosa, a Cressy, a Concord, these guys have a reputation to maintain,
Yeah.
and they are always going to deliver the product. And you pretty much know what the finished version is going to be.
Yeah.
But if it's some of these developers, it's a guy with his mom, and
Hmm.
it's their very first project. They maybe just came to Canada 3 years ago. They don't know anything about building a project here. They don't know how to liaise with city officials at City Hall about meeting, engineering and geological studies or whatever kinds of study, environmental studies that they have to have done. And they just drop the ball. And it can be frustrating because once you finally bought, now you're waiting 3 or 4 years and you're not getting much information, which
Yeah.
is usually a red flag. But I
Yeah.
think you got to really find out about these kinds of projects. Remember, there was one a number of years ago in Vancouver, maybe 7, 8 years ago, where it got canceled because apparently the developer cut down a tree, like the tree behind you there, over your right shoulder, Tim.
Yeah.
and and uh, I mean, what kind of a mistake is that? And then there was some discussion that maybe they did it intentionally because they didn't really want to move forward with the project anyway, because
Mm,
they could have just gotten more by just reselling that whole plot of land. And
yeah.
then under a different name, they were then marketing a project in downtown Vancouver. But just by asking through the grapevine, we could find out.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I think, yeah, it's like any investment, anything, the reward, is going to have a risk attached to it. So just make sure you
Yeah.
understand that and do your due diligence.
Tim, how are we doing for time?
We just got a couple more minutes here, but before we got to run. But yeah, you want to
Tim,
tie us up?
let's jump to the changes. The big one coming on in the federal budget, capital
Hmm.
gains tax it was actually raised on proceeds over $250,000. Our friends in Ottawa there are running up our credit card bills. Deficits are running at $40 billion a year. And so they've got to rake in a bit more cash, a bit more tax dollars. How do you feel about the change that they made? And the change was, of course, going from what, 50% to 67% is now taxable.
Yeah, and that's over $250,000 in capital gains, and I think one of the big things that kind of gets missed a little bit is corporations. They get taxed on that immediately. There's no $250,000 threshold for them, and which I think is a big factor for individuals professionals who, I deal with professionals all the time in corporations who, that's their retirement strategy. They have a corporation where they hold assets and they don't have a pension or anything like that. And now their tax on that is going to go significantly higher. So I think that's an issue. And, overall, I think, Canada's in a bit of a productivity crisis, and we need to get more productive as a society, or as a country, I should say. And increasing taxes on capital gains, I think kind of heads you in the other direction, because, productivity is stimulated by capital, and, people have to want to take risks with their capital. And, if the reward is just getting dwindled away by tax, I don't think it incentivizes that. So I don't love it. I mean, every econom I'm not an economist, but every economist that I've heard chat about it, or like people who studied economics talk about it, none of them seem to be in favor. So it seems to be a political maneuver to try and incite some sort of class thing. Hey, we're taking from the rich and giving it to everybody else. But so it seems to be a bit of a political maneuver. Um, I wonder how long it's going to be around, if I'm being honest. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah. I was reading that Toby Lütke of Shopify and some of the other tech guys in Ontario were commenting on this and saying, guys, this doesn't help our case. We're trying to
Yeah.
grow the business sector here. You're not
Yeah.
helping us.
Yeah.
There was a great quote I read on Reddit that I just thought that really kind of smashed this home. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you like, yeah, go for it.
This basically the guy was just saying, and this comes from a poster named Sokos. You have choices. People can use houses as their retirement plan and not need government handouts when they retire. You can tax the hell out of it to the point that it makes 0 cents to own a second house. And people will just keep their money in the bank or max out on their RRSPs. Nobody is stupid enough to invest when the markets are in the dumps, and you are more likely to lose money than gain it. If you don't let people do smart things with their money, you will end up with a bunch of retired people that will need government subsidies to survive. Um, what would you, I mean, I think he's hitting the philosophy here on the nail on the head. But I mean, if you had money now, where would you invest it? Would you put it in real estate? Would you buy a second or third place? Would you put it in stocks, or would you put it in the US and in some other vehicle?
Well, mine is in the US. So I, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that answers the question
Can I
is,
ask where?
so I mean,
Are you privy
yeah,
to
yeah. I
share?
mean, I generally think our dollar is going to get sacrificed a little bit here when they cut rates. So, most of my investments are in US dollars, kind of some general US stock market, ETFs, some money market funds, stuff like that. But most of my investments, sadly, are in US dollars because, yeah, I'm not that bullish on the Canadian economy, if you will.
Does any of this have to do with the fact that you have to pay more taxes in Canada?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I still am going to have to pay taxes on it. So not really. But what I think is where it could come in is foreign investors, people who are choosing people with actual like I don't have actual capital that's going to make a difference to anybody. But people with actual capital that can make a difference, they're going to be scared away from investing in Canada now. And I think that's, one of the real issues.